Once Darrel is done, then they'll bring around the microphone and you can ask questions then. So hold your questions till after the program, if you would, please. Darrel?
All right, thank you. It's almost become a tradition to come here to the Carbondale Library in February and speak to members of the DAR, and then of course it's also open to the public. So I appreciate that and want to recognize and thank the DAR for inviting me to come and speak to you this morning. And the first lesson people learn about the Underground Railroad, actually two things they learn. One is it's not a railroad, right? And two is it's not under the ground. That's confusing for grade school kids to kind of wrap their head, or then why do you call it the Underground Railroad if that's the case? What I'm going to present today does not contradict those lessons, but what I want to leave you with is that abolitionists in Illinois realized the potential of the Illinois Central Railroad that connected Cairo, Illinois and Chicago, Illinois very early on. The other thing is that, and this is sometimes left out of the narrative, although it's changing quite a bit, is the idea that African Americans were not only among the freedom seekers, people fleeing slavery, but they were also among the agents and conductors of the Underground Railroad. And this was new to me, and a historian named Owen Mulder pointed this out in his research. He said that the Underground Railroad activity was the first social movement in which black and white people worked cooperatively. All right. Doesn't seem to want to advance. Yeah. The Illinois Central was fundamental to the development of the Underground Railroad from Cairo to Chicago. And the Illinois Central was founded in 1851, and by 1855, Cairo, Illinois was connected by rail with Chicago, Illinois. Even before that, people realized the potential of the Illinois Central as an Underground Railroad route. And as early as 1854, a married couple from southeast Missouri who were enslaved crossed the river, made it to Cairo, Illinois, were given tickets on the Illinois Central going north. In 1854, the route to Chicago wasn't completed all the way, but the other route going north to Galena was well completed. And when the couple got to McLean County, Illinois, the conductor put them off the train. They were told you cannot stay on the train, you don't have freedom papers, so they were put off the train. And in 1854, other people have been put off the train. If you know history, from Harriet Tubman to Homer Plessy, historically there have been hundreds of people put off the train. This couple were put off, and a widowed white woman living in McLean County in a town called Lexington got them on their journey the rest of the way to Chicago. The Illinois Central and that route as an Underground Railroad route was becoming so well known that a bill was introduced in the state legislature that said this. The Illinois legislature said, quote, "No black or colored person denominated Negro shall be carried on or along any railroad in the state without a certificate of freedom presented to the conductor." The bill did not pass, but the bill was introduced in the Illinois legislature. Another self-emancipator, I don't even know the name of the couple that I talked about from the 1854 incident, but another self-emancipator was Joseph Rodney. And Joseph Rodney was born into slavery in southeast Missouri. He was born just a few miles northeast of Charleston, Missouri. And he was likely one of the 19 people listed in the 1850 slave schedule in the household of John Rodney. He was 19 years old. He was listed as male and listed as mulatto. Mulatto was a legal term which meant that at least one of his grandparents would be classified as Negro. In 1852, John Rodney died. And according to the law, unless a will directed who the enslaved person was to go to as property, then there would be an appraisal made and an auction would be carried out. So among the personal property in the estate file in Mississippi County, Missouri, John Rodney's property consisted of, and I know the handwriting is hard to read, but it says, quote, "one Negro boy said to be worth $800. And that's the equivalent of about $35,000 in 2026. Not to make a point of the monetary amount, but just to get you to think that they were assigning a monetary amount, any monetary amount, to a human being. And think about how you would feel if a monetary amount was assigned to you or to your daughter or to your son. How much would you be worth? There were 17 other people that were enslaved by John Rodney, and in his will, which he made in 1844, he bequeathed Joe Filbert Rodney and Lyndia to his son Thomas Rodney. Those that had not been bequeathed, there was the auction, the slave auction, which was held from the courthouse steps in Charleston, Missouri, at the county courthouse in 1852. I don't know who Lyndia was. She was bequeathed by John Rodney to his son Thomas with Joseph or Joe. She could have been a sister. She could have been a mother. She could have been no relationship. But others were auctioned off. So at least Joseph didn't have to go through the humiliation of a slave auction. The yellow highlighted part shows where the Rodney farm was located. Note that it's right next to the Mississippi River. Thomas Rodney had purchased that land in 1837, and that's where Joseph Rodney was living when he decided to flee. And Joseph Rodney decided, what happened to make him decide that, I don't know, but he decided he was going to flee, leave Thomas Rodney and the Rodney family, and he walked. The road is kind of hard to see, but there's a road that goes along the river, curves, and goes to a place called Bird's Point. And there was a ferry across the river from Birds Point, Missouri to Cairo, Illinois. And Joseph took that route and crossed the river to Cairo, and he arrived there on August 9th, 1855. It probably only took him maybe an hour or so to walk that loop around the river. It was only a few miles. According to what Thomas Rodney, Joseph's enslaver, said, was that Joseph fled to Cairo, quote, at the special insistence and request of the Illinois Central. Now, if that's true, which I have no reason to doubt, there were others that were helping Joseph Rodney. He wasn't operating or acting on his own. According to a Cairo newspaper account, quote, a colored woman well known in Cairo to be a free woman aided Joseph by purchasing 2 tickets on the Illinois Central to Chicago, Illinois. Now, I think the woman accompanied Joseph so that she could turn him over to others in Chicago, abolitionists on the Underground Railroad. But 2 tickets were purchased, and they were purchased at the Illinois Central Depot. The arrow, that's a photograph of Cairo in 1861, and the arrow shows the building that operated as the Illinois Depot. There's a historical marker at the site now, and I think George Hunt, I know Don Patton, others were very active in getting that site marked by the Network to Freedom. I don't know who the woman was. Newspaper account said she was well known in Cairo. In 1855, there was a census taken. And in 1855, there were only 13 African Americans living in Cairo. One of those households was headed by a woman named Melinda Harville. And I think Melinda Harville was the person that helped Joseph. And I didn't just jump to that conclusion. After Joseph got his tickets and they went to Chicago, Melinda Harville's house was burned by arsonists, or the newspaper said incendiaries. I believe that was retaliation for being involved in helping Joseph get his freedom. When the train left Cairo, it passed through Mound City, passed through Mounds, Illinois, went to Villa Ridge, and the conductor came up to Joseph at Villa Ridge when the train was stopped and said, I need to see freedom papers. And Joseph said, I don't have my freedom papers with me. He said, I'm free. He said, I live along the Mississippi River. I think he probably mentioned Thomas Rodney by name, thinking maybe the story would be more believable. The conductor, who was a white man, had a decision to make. Do I trust what Joseph is saying or not? And white people in power and the legal system was slanted at that time to where the testimony of people of color was not held at the same level as white people. And so the conductor said, Joseph, you have to get off the train here in Villa Ridge. The man that's pictured here was Dr. Daniel Arter. And he's known as he was a well-known physician representative in Pulaski County, Illinois at the time. At the right is his grave marker in Villa Ridge. But he came forward and interviewed Joseph. And his words to the conductor were, quote, "I believe this Negro is all right." And they let him pass. They let him continue on. Dr. Arter was also a member of the Republican Party Central Committee in 1855. And the Republican Party, unlike the Republican Party of today, the Republican Party was the more liberal of the parties. And it wasn't an abolitionist party, but it was the closest thing the country had to an anti-slavery party at that time. And Dr. Arter was one of only 2 people who voted for the Republican Party candidate in Pulaski County in 1854. Joseph slowly made his way to Chicago. The trains only went about 15 or 20 miles per hour at that time. So it was just a slow, monotonous, and you could hear the clickety-clack as the train went on the rails. I've ridden the train, many of you probably have, from Carbondale to New Orleans. I rode one from Cairo to Chicago. I looked out the window and it seemed to be zipping by pretty fast, but not in 1855. The other difference is they stopped back then in every town to pick up passengers, let people off, pick up freight. It took about 20 hours from the time the train left Chicago at 6 a.m. to get, or left Cairo at 6 a.m. to get to Chicago. Chicago was, to use a modern day term, Chicago was a sanctuary city. It was a sanctuary city for people that were fleeing from slavery, for freedom seekers, people looking for freedom. And I say it was a sanctuary city because it was loaded, not the majority of people there, but they had an abundance of abolitionists willing to help people fleeing from slavery once they got to Chicago. Thomas Rodney was hot on the heels of Joseph. When he found out Joseph had left, he came to Cairo looking for him and got a ticket on the next train to Chicago to try to find him. He was about a day behind because from what I can find out, the train left Cairo, passenger train, one a day at 6 a.m. And Joseph had left on the 6 a.m. train. So Thomas was there to find him. He at least had to wait to the next train to get to Chicago. The amazing part of the story, when Thomas did get to Chicago, he was walking along the street in Chicago and looked across and saw Joseph. What are the chances? 2 people from Charleston, Missouri, meeting in Chicago. Chicago had about 75,000 people living there. So it was a big town, but not the huge city that it is today. When their eyes met, Joseph was scared. Thomas realized, now what am I going to do? Here's Joseph. I can't just take him because people are going to help him if I do. So he went for a federal marshal because under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, he had to have a federal marshal who could help him capture Joseph. Private citizens were not supposed to get involved anymore. It was supposed to be a federal marshal. The abolitionists in Chicago were so well organized, they printed up handbills So while Thomas is going around trying to locate the office of the federal marshal, trying to find Joseph somewhere in the city of Chicago with the federal marshal, the abolitionists in Chicago had printed up handbills and circulated them among their friends, saying, Thomas Rodney, an enslaver from Charleston, Missouri, is here. We're going to protect Joseph. So be on the lookout, be ready. There are 4 or 5 documented cases in Chicago in the 1850s where abolitionists, so-called armed mobs of people, banded together to rescue freedom seekers, take them away from the so-called slave catchers that had come to Chicago to take them back into slavery. Thomas had to leave Chicago alone. And the story of Joseph, what happened to Joseph, I haven't been able to find any record of Joseph. Did he go to Canada? Did he stay in Chicago and find a job? Where did he go? What did he do? I can't pick up the story of Joseph. But Thomas comes back to Missouri, comes back to Charleston, comes back to Cape Girardeau, and tells everybody, you won't believe what happened. And the first newspaper to print the story of Joseph was the Cape Girardeau Eagle newspaper. But that story is picked up by St. Louis newspapers, by newspapers in Kansas City, Jefferson City, Missouri, all over the country. And it says the Illinois Central is enticing enslaved people away and helping them find their freedom in Chicago. And the Cairo Times was one of the newspapers published in Cairo. It had an interesting comment, and you can read between the lines or just take it at face value, but it's interesting. The Cairo Times reported this. It would be greatly to the disadvantage of our town if it were believed abroad that we are a community of Negro stealers. We are as sorry for Mr. Rodney's loss as anyone else. Mr. Rodney, Thomas Rodney, hired a lawyer. First, he hired the guy on the left from Benton, Illinois, named William A. Denning. And I think Mr. Denning died shortly after he started this case. And so when the case comes to trial, the man on the right, John Doherty from Jonesboro, was the lawyer. And Thomas Rodney sued the Illinois Central in October 1855 for $3,000 in damages. Now, the equivalent, if you use the inflation calculator, and who knows how accurate those are, that's $112,000 in 2026. And Mr. Rodney said, quote, the Illinois Central, he said, quote, Joseph escaped from my service at the special instance and request of the Illinois Central Railroad, who then carelessly and negligently took Joseph on its cars, carried him away as a passenger to Chicago, where he escaped from my services. That was the charge against the Illinois Central. It was also while they were waiting for this case to come to trial that Melinda Harville's house was burned in Cairo. The case took several months to actually come to trial, but when it did come to trial, they met at the Thebes courthouse. Thebes was the county seat for Alexander County. John A. McClernand from Shawneetown pictured here, was the attorney that represented the Illinois Central. Another attorney that often represented the Illinois Central was Abraham Lincoln. And of course, it's a shame that it wasn't Abraham Lincoln who came to Thebes to represent the railroad, but it wasn't. It was John A. McClernand. And when the case came to trial at Thebes on April 28, 1856, the judge ordered Thomas Rodney to pay for the legal expenses of the Illinois Central. And the judge did not necessarily rule in favor of Rodney. What the judge said was that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 provides for the punishment of people that obstruct the recapture of a fugitive, and punishes those who harbor and conceal fugitives. This is a matter for a federal court to decide, not a circuit court. Rodney appealed the case to the Illinois Supreme Court. One of the things I learned in doing research on this case was that there was no appellate court. Not until 1877 did Illinois have an appellate court. So if you appealed from the circuit court, it went right to the Supreme Court. The judge, Judge Onias C. Skinner, Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court, came to Mount Vernon to hear the case. So not only was there no appellate court, but the judges traveled a circuit. And when you didn't take your case to Springfield, Springfield came to you. The judges came to you. In this case, they came to Mount Vernon and heard the case. This is the decision of Justice Skinner. He said, "The presumption in Illinois is that all persons are free without regard to color. And although the laws of Missouri may have made Joseph a slave there, in Illinois, those laws are not binding. Rodney, under the laws of Illinois, has no property in the fugitive and can here, under state authority, assert no property in or power over him." That's a relief, right? Good decision. It's also historically important because when this decision was made, word got out. Hey, if you're a freedom seeker and you can get on the Illinois Central, they can't put you off. Not that they won't, and not that it didn't happen, but your chances are a lot better now since this decision has been made. So what Cairo needed now, since Melinda Harville's been burned out, was another conductor. And that conductor was a man named George J. Burroughs. Burroughs said he was recruited in Chicago in 1857 after the Rodney decision was announced. And he was asked to go to Cairo, be a porter on the Illinois Central Railroad, and assist people that are fleeing from slavery. And George Burroughs was born in Canada. His father had been a fugitive from slavery, fled from Upper New York to Canada, where George was born. And when he went to Cairo, he had lots of opportunities to meet with enslaved people because right across the Mississippi River is Missouri, a slave state. Right across the Ohio River is Kentucky, a slave state. And boats were docking and leaving the Cairo port maybe hourly, definitely many a day. And who was on those boats? They weren't all free white workers. Many of them on the boats were enslaved. And they worked as cooks, they worked as deckhands. Many on the boat were on their way to slave markets in New Orleans or north to slave markets in St. Louis. So George Burroughs had lots of opportunities to interact with people that were enslaved. He was very brazen in his contact with people who were enslaved. He was so open about it that he came in to work one day, and the guy that worked in the office said, quote, "Your business has been given away. People know what you're up to." And there was a mob that had organized in Cairo looking specifically for George Burroughs. And George Burroughs wrote later in 1896, he said, "I heard the mob searching for me, swearing that they would murder me." Now, a couple things we can glean from that. One is, since he was tipped off, it seems likely that there were others involved in the Underground Railroad besides just George Burroughs. Burroughs was hidden in a box in the porter's room until the next train would leave for Chicago the next morning. And he got on the train and he made it to Centralia, just a little north of Centralia. And he escaped the mob in Cairo. One of the other things that George Burroughs wrote was that his first freedom seeker that he helped escape from Cairo and make it to Chicago was a 7 or 8-year-old girl. And he said, "I hid her in a box and I covered her with quilts in that box. And she rode in the box to Chicago, covered up with quilts, 7 or 8 years old." And Burroughs said, quote, "I felt very proud that I had one to report for what I had done when I got to Chicago." Lastly, he recorded how he got the girl past the slave catchers waiting for them in Chicago. And he said, "I told her, 'Now, I'm going to take you out.' I said, 'They've arrived in Chicago at this time.' I said, 'You must be brave and do not be a coward.'" She's 7 or 8 years old. "Don't be a coward. We came out to pass those men, the slave catchers that were waiting. One of them placed his hands on the girl. I saw the girl had given up and was afraid to open her mouth. I made a resolution at once to save this girl. I turned around, threw his hands off of her, and got between him and the girl. And I asked him, 'What do you mean by insulting this girl? If you do so again, I will put my hands on you.' He said, 'I don't want to hurt that girl.' I told him that she was my cousin and that she had been working out in the country and working for some poor whites who had cheated her out of her wages, and I had went and brought her home. We went on uptown in Chicago, but the men followed. We went through a back alley and the men lost us. I carried her to the office. We found some of her friends, and I gave her to them." Mr. Burroughs couldn't go back to Cairo. His story was out. People knew. They were looking for him. It was too dangerous. What he does is stay in Chicago for a while and works. And during the Civil War, he enlisted in Company L, 2nd U.S. Colored Cavalry in Troy, Pennsylvania. He was pensioned, and this is a record from his pension papers. Notice one of them, he talks about his wife, and her name was Maria Smith, and he writes, she was a slave girl. And he didn't know about any former marriages she may have had. He was discharged in 1865 as an orderly in a hospital. He worked as a cook. He worked on steamers or steamboats on the rivers. He worked as a blacksmith, a mason. He was a plasterer. That's a job that he did in Cairo after he comes back to Cairo. And after the war, he lived in London, Canada, Cleveland, Ohio, and New York City. 1879 is when Burroughs comes back to Cairo, and he stays in Cairo, resides there until 1902, when he's admitted to the Soldiers' Home in Danville, Illinois. He later moved to Detroit, Michigan, and was at the Central Branch for Disabled Soldiers at Jefferson, Ohio, in 1920. He comes back to live with his daughter in Detroit in 1930. He's on the 1930 census there, and he dies at the age of 98 in Detroit. This is his military marker where he's buried in a cemetery in Detroit, Michigan. The Underground Railroad in Southern Illinois helped many people gain their freedom. I can't put a number to that, but many people did gain their freedom. Most of the names and the individual stories will never be known at this point. But the point is, there were freedom seekers. There were people who passed through Southern Illinois trying to escape slavery in Southeast Missouri, Kentucky, or wherever. And they found, some of those people found a few residents in Southern Illinois, black and white, who were willing to help. They were willing to risk their reputations, risk their careers. In the case of Melinda Harville, she risked her house and all of her property. Risk your finances, and even risk your own freedom to help enslaved people gain their liberty. They were a rarity. Don't think Southern Illinois was filled with abolitionists, people that would help freedom seekers, but they were here. They were here. It's been a privilege to talk to you and have this opportunity to share some of these stories and to honor and remember those people who were lovers of liberty, lovers of freedom. If you have questions for me, I'll be glad to try to answer those or pass those on. I think someone said there's a mic so that people on Zoom can hear you. If you have a question or a comment, either one. Yes, she's bringing the mic.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. What is the evidence that the Illinois Central invited John Rodney to ride the train to Chicago?
Right. What was the evidence? It was an accusation that was made. So with Joseph Rodney's case as the freedom seeker, there's no evidence other than the accusation. I would like to know how Thomas Rodney, the enslaver, came up with that or came to that conclusion. But I don't have any evidence And since the case never came to a real trial, we don't have the court documents that would provide that. But that's a good point. Yes. Oh, she has one back there.
I assume that the IC, Illinois Central, was headquartered in Chicago?
That, not originally. They had, obviously, they had offices in Chicago. But originally, they had offices all along the proposed route. Galena was a big office. Springfield, the state capital. There were corporate, we would today call them corporate offices in Chicago as well as Cairo.
Well, I'm curious as to whether the owners were aware of this,
Yeah.
supported it, permitted it.
Yeah. That's the big question. The thing about researching the Underground Railroad is that this was illegal activity. And this was secret. So records were seldom kept. Newspaper accounts tell part of the story, but there's no memo from the president of the Illinois Central. Hey, we're going to help freedom seekers. But George Burroughs' testimony was that he was recruited by the Illinois Central to do that. He doesn't identify the person, and the fact that for it to be successful, there had to be others involved all along the route. Now, was that sanctioned by the Illinois Central? I can't conclude either way at this point. But another good question.
Darrel, have you found any evidence, so Joseph didn't have papers.
Right.
Was there any evidence that the abolitionists tried to forge papers for people and
Yes.
change his name, perhaps, or something?
So two things. One, there is evidence, as a matter of fact, in Alexander County, there is a court case from the 1830s in which an individual was charged with forging freedom papers for a freedom seeker. And that person was put on trial and found guilty of having done that. So yes, it did happen, and yes, freedom papers were sometimes forged. In the case of Joseph, I have no record. There's no mention of any freedom papers other than the fact that he didn't have them with him.
And then what would have been the punishment for somebody helping in that way or another way?
It would be time in prison. It would be a fine. And there are cases in Illinois, not in Alexander, Pulaski County, but in Illinois, of conductors on the Illinois Railroad being charged with harboring and concealing a fugitive. A famous case was Dr. Eels in Quincy. There were some out of Alton, Illinois. And there's some instances where those people were found guilty. And I think the fine was $500, which would have been tens of thousands of dollars today. She's bringing a mic.
You may have said, but was Joseph the first person to escape by way of Illinois Central, or just the first documented one? Do you know if there was any before him?
Yeah. So I mentioned one that was in 1854 that went to McLean County. And even the names, and that's one of the other problems with researching Underground Railroad activity is there's not always documentation. And people didn't want to talk about it until after the Civil War's over. Now, everybody wants to have a site that's Underground Railroad site. But in the 1850s, since it was illegal, people didn't document it. We don't even know the name of that man and woman who fled and made it as far as McLean County. But the fact that a law was proposed that would make it illegal for people to travel on any railroad without freedom papers makes me think there was more activity than just these few that I've been able to document. All right. Okay. Once again, I appreciate your time and appreciate the opportunity to share what I've been able to find out about freedom seekers and the Underground Railroad here in Southern Illinois. Thank you.